The deepest wounds come from those who should love us most. When your own family decides you're worthless and sells you like property, it breaks something inside that never quite heals. 52-year-old Elenya lived this nightmare when her relatives sold her to a mysterious nobleman, claiming she was barren and had no value. They sent her to Lord Varek's dark castle, expecting her to disappear forever. But within 2 days of meeting this strange, ancient man, something impossible happened. The woman everyone called Infertile was suddenly carrying a child that would change everything. How could this miracle occur when doctors had declared it impossible for decades? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Thornwick like the whispered prayers of the faithful, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and wild herbs that had become as familiar to Elenya as her own heartbeat. She moved through the village square with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to find purpose in service, her worn leather satchel bouncing gently against her hip with each measured step. The healing pouch had been her constant companion for 3 decades, longer than some marriages, longer than most lives in this harsh corner of the realm. At 52, Elenya possessed the kind of weathered beauty that spoke of wisdom earned through countless seasons of tending the sick and comforting the dying. Her hands, though lined with age and stained with the remnants of countless herbal preparations, moved with the sure precision of a master craftsman. The silver streaks threading through her dark hair caught the early sunlight, creating a crown that no noble title could match. She had delivered half the children in Thornwick, set more broken bones than she could count, and eased the passing of the Petar. Old, with gentle remedies that seemed to work as much through compassion as through any earthly ingredient. The village itself was a testament to the enduring nature of simple lives lived well. Stone cottages with thatched roofs lined narrow streets that had been worn smooth by generations of feet, hooves, and cartwheels. The blacksmith's forge already rang with the rhythm of hammer on anvil, sending sparks dancing in the cool air like tiny stars seeking their way home. Women gathered at the well, their voices creating a comfortable murmur as they shared news and concerns with the easy familiarity of neighbors who had weathered many storms together. Yet for all her contributions, for all the lives she had saved and the pain she had eased, Elenya carried a burden that seemed to grow heavier with each passing year. In a world where a woman's worth was measured by the children she bore and the bloodline she continued, she had failed in the most fundamental way. 25 years of marriage to her late husband Marcus had produced no child, no heir, no continuation of their modest family line. The village had watched with growing concern as month after month passed without the joyful announcement they all expected. When Marcus died of fever 8 years ago, that concern had gradually transformed into something closer to pity. Her brother Aldrich made no effort to hide his growing resentment. A man whose own successful merchant ventures had been blessed with 4 healthy sons, he viewed Elenya's continued residence in the family's ancestral home as an increasingly problematic reminder of failure. The house, though modest by noble standards, sat on valuable land near the village centre, land that could be sold, developed, or passed to his sons if only his barren sister would finally accept her place in the natural order. "Another morning spent gathering weeds, sister?" Aldrich's voice carried across the market square with the particular edge he reserved for their public encounters. He approached with the confident stride of a man accustomed to respect, his fine wool cloak marking him as one of Thornwick's more prosperous citizens. Behind him walked his eldest son, Willem, whose resemblance to his father extended beyond physical features to include the same calculating look when he gazed upon Elenya. "Gathering healing herbs, brother," Elenya replied with the patient tone she had perfected over years of such exchanges. She did not slow her pace toward the cottage of widow Marta, whose cough had worsened during the night. Young Thomas brought word that his grandmother's breathing has become labored. The willow bark tea I prepared should ease her discomfort. Aldrich's laugh held no warmth. Always tending to other people's families while neglecting the needs of your own. Father would be ashamed to see his bloodline end with such dedication to strangers. The words stung because they carried a grain of truth wrapped in cruelty. Their father had indeed hoped for grandchildren, had spoken often of the importance of family legacy, of blood continuing blood through the generations. But he had also raised Elenya to understand that service to others was its own form of nobility, that healing the sick was a calling worthy of respect. She chose to remember that part of his teaching rather than dwell on disappointments that could not be undone. The needs I tend to are human needs, Aldrich. Suffering recognizes no family boundaries. Pretty words from a woman whose womb has never known life. Willem's voice carried the casual cruelty of youth, but his eyes held the shrewd calculation of his bloodline. How can you claim to understand families when you've never created one? The market square fell silent around them, vendors and customers suddenly finding great interest in their wares, rather than witness this family drama played out in public view. Elenya felt the familiar weight of shame settle across her shoulders like a mantle she could never fully remove. These were her people, the villagers she had served faithfully for decades, yet she knew they saw her through the lens of her fundamental failure as a woman. She continued toward widow Marta's cottage without responding, her healing pouch suddenly feeling heavier with each step. Behind her, she could hear Aldrich's voice resuming its normal volume as he discussed business matters with his son, the conversation already moving past her as if she were merely another obstacle in his path. Widow Marta's cottage squatted at the end of a row of similar structures, its windows glowing with the warm light of a well-maintained hearth. The old woman had been one of Thornwick's most skilled weavers in her youth, her fingers creating patterns that seemed to capture sunlight in their threads. Now those same fingers trembled as she struggled to manage the simple tasks of daily survival. "Elenya, bless you for coming so quickly," Marta whispered as she opened her door. Her voice carried the raspy quality that spoke of fluid gathering in places where it should not be, and her pale complexion confirmed Elenya's growing concern about her condition. "The willow bark will help with the inflammation," Elenya said gently as she guided the older woman back to her chair by the fire. "But I want to prepare something stronger for the congestion. Have you been keeping warm enough during the night?" As she worked, grinding herbs and mixing preparations with the automatic precision of long practice, Elenya found herself thinking about legacy in ways that her brother's harsh words had stirred to life. What legacy did a childless healer leave behind? Were the lives she had saved, the pain she had eased, the comfort she had provided worth less in the grand scheme of things than the continuation of bloodlines? Marta seemed to sense her internal struggle. "You're thinking heavy thoughts today, child." "I'm hardly a child anymore, Marta. Perhaps it's time. I accepted that some dreams are not meant to be fulfilled." The old woman's eyes, though clouded with age, carried the sharp intelligence that had made her one of the village's wisest counselors in her prime. "Dreams and purposes are not always the same thing, Elenya. I never bore children either, but I taught dozens of young girls to weave. Their children wear clothes made with techniques I passed down. Is that not a form of legacy? It's different for you. You chose your path. I had mine chosen for me by circumstances beyond my control, and yet here you sit, mixing remedies that will ease an old woman's breathing for another night, perhaps another week. If that's not choosing your path, I don't know what is." Elenya completed her preparations in thoughtful silence, measuring precise amounts of dried elderflower and adding them to the steaming preparation. The cottage filled with the sharp, clean scent of the healing mixture, a smell that always brought her comfort regardless of the troubles weighing on her heart. As she prepared to leave, Marta caught her hand with surprising strength. "There are forces at work in this world that we don't always understand, child. Sometimes what appears to be an ending is actually a beginning in disguise." The words followed Elenya as she made her way back through the village, past the market square where her brother continued his business dealings, past the well where women still gathered to share the eternal concerns of their daily lives. She paused at the entrance to her own cottage, looking up at the structure that had housed her family for 3 generations. The building itself was solid, well maintained, with the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of pride and permanence. The herb garden that surrounded it represented decades of careful cultivation, each plant chosen for its healing properties and tended with the devotion others might reserve for their children. Inside, the main room served as both her living space and her workshop, with shelves lined with carefully labeled jars and bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters like fragrant prayer flags. But increasingly, the cottage felt less like a home and more like a monument to a life half-lived. Her brother's visits had become more frequent and more pointed, his suggestions about her future growing less subtle with each conversation. The family land was valuable. His sons were reaching the age where they needed to establish their own households, and a barren woman past her childbearing years served no useful purpose in his expanding vision of family prosperity. That evening, as Elenya sat by her fire grinding the last of her summer harvest of healing herbs, she found herself examining her hands in the flickering light. They were capable hands, gentle hands that had brought comfort to countless people over the years. Yet they had never held a child of her own, never guided tiny fingers in their first attempts to grasp and explore the world. The absence felt particularly acute in the growing darkness, surrounded by the tools of her trade, but isolated from the human connections that gave life its deepest meaning. A soft knock at her door interrupted these melancholy reflections. When she opened it, she found young Thomas standing in the gathering darkness, his face bright with relief. "Grandmother's breathing has eased, Mistress Elenya. She wanted me to bring you this." He held out a small loaf of bread, still warm from the oven. "She says your healing touch has given her another night of peaceful rest." As Elenya accepted the simple gift, she felt something shift inside her chest. Perhaps Marta was right about legacy taking different forms than the obvious ones. Perhaps the warmth in Thomas's eyes, the gratitude in his voice, the countless similar moments over the years, represented a different kind of family, one bound not by blood, but by the choice to care for one another. "Tell your grandmother that her gratitude means more to me than she knows," Elenya said softly. "And Thomas, remember that healing is not just about herbs and remedies. Sometimes the most powerful medicine is simply showing someone that they matter." As the boy disappeared into the night, Elenya closed her door and returned to her fire. But now the cottage felt less like a monument to failure and more like a sanctuary where important work was accomplished. She had no way of knowing that forces beyond her understanding were already setting events in motion that would transform not only her own life, but the very nature of the world she thought she understood. The healing pouch sat beside her chair, its worn leather surface reflecting the firelight like an old friend, ready for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. The summons came on a grey morning when autumn's chill had settled into the bones of Thornwick like an unwelcome guest who refused to leave. Elenya found the message waiting beneath her door, a simple piece of parchment bearing her brother's seal, and a request that she join the family for an urgent discussion at his residence. The formal tone struck her as odd, given Aldrich's usual preference for delivering his opinions in public settings, where his authority could be witnessed by others. She made her way through the village streets with growing unease, noting how conversations seemed to pause as she passed, how eyes followed her progress with expressions that mixed pity and something else, knowledge, perhaps, of events she had yet to discover. The morning market bustled with its usual activity, but even there, She sensed an undercurrent of whispered discussions that ceased when she drew near. Aldrich's house stood at the prosperous end of the village, its stone construction and slate roof marking it as the residence of a man who had prospered through careful planning and shrewd business dealings. The interior reflected his success, with polished wooden furniture, woven tapestries, and the subtle signs of wealth that came from connections extending beyond the boundaries of their small community. She found not just Aldrich waiting for her, but the entire family council, his wife Margot, his 4 sons, and even his eldest daughter-in-law, all arranged around the great table in his main hall, like judges preparing to deliver a verdict. The formality of the arrangement sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Sister, please sit," Aldrich said, his voice carrying a tone of false warmth that did nothing to ease her growing anxiety. "We have a matter of great importance to discuss with you." Elenya took the indicated chair, noting how it had been positioned to face the assembled family members, rather than allowing her to sit among them as an equal participant. The symbolism was clear and deliberate. She was here to receive a decision, not to contribute to making one. "As you know," Aldrich began, settling into his role as family patriarch with visible satisfaction, "our father left specific instructions about the care and welfare of his children. He understood that family prosperity depends on making difficult decisions for the greater good." Margot leaned forward with the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. "We've been blessed with an opportunity that could solve many problems at once. A nobleman from the Northern Territories has made an inquiry about acquiring a mature woman of good character for his household." The words hit Elenya like a physical blow. Acquiring? Willem, Aldrich's eldest son, consulted a piece of parchment with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed his part in this presentation. "Lord Varek of Ravenshallow has offered a substantial sum for a woman of suitable age and temperament to serve as companion in his estate. The arrangement would provide you with security and purpose while relieving the family of the burden of your continued maintenance." "You're speaking of selling me," Elenya said quietly, the words falling into the sudden silence like stones dropped into still water. "You're discussing selling me like livestock?" Aldrich's facade of warmth finally cracked, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "We're discussing a mutually beneficial arrangement that recognizes reality. You have no husband, no children, no prospects for either at your age. This nobleman seeks a woman of maturity and experience, not a young bride. It's an opportunity that may never come again. What do you know of this Lord Varek?" Elenya asked, grasping for any information that might help her understand the magnitude of what was being proposed. "What manner of man sends messengers to purchase women from their families?" The family members exchanged glances that spoke of conversations held without her knowledge, decisions reached through discussions she had never been invited to join. Finally, Margot spoke with the carefully neutral tone of someone delivering rehearsed information. "He's said to be a recluse who rarely leaves his estate. Wealthy, certainly, given the sum he's offered. The messenger indicated he values wisdom and experience over youth and beauty, qualities you possess in abundance." "The messenger?" Elenya repeated, noting their careful avoidance of describing this intermediary in any detail. "What manner of man speaks for this mysterious nobleman?" Aldrich's jaw tightened with the impatience of someone whose carefully planned presentation was being disrupted by inconvenient questions. "The details of his household arrangements are hardly our concern. What matters is that he's offering a solution to a problem that grows more pressing with each passing season." "I am not a problem to be solved," Elenya said, rising from her chair with a dignity that seemed to surprise the assembled family members. "I am a healer who has served this community faithfully for 30 years. I have value that cannot be measured in coins." Willem laughed with the casual cruelty of youth. "Value to whom? The herbs you gather could be collected by any village girl. The remedies you mix could be learned by someone with a future ahead of them rather than only a past behind them. The words stung because they carried the weight of truth wrapped in malice. How many times had she wondered the same thing during the long nights when sleep eluded her and doubts crept in like unwelcome visitors? How many times had she questioned whether her contributions truly mattered in the larger scheme of village life? "The decision has been made," Aldrich said, with the finality of someone accustomed to having his pronouncements accepted without further discussion. "Lord Varek's messenger will return tomorrow morning to complete the arrangements. You have tonight to prepare whatever personal belongings you wish to take with you." Elenya looked around the room at faces that had shared her childhood, her youth, her hopes and disappointments. These were the people who should have stood by her when life proved difficult, who should have valued her for more than her ability to continue bloodlines or enhance family prosperity. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound because it came wrapped in the language of practical necessity. "And if I refuse?" The silence that greeted this question lasted long enough to provide its own answer. Finally, Aldrich spoke with the patience of someone explaining obvious facts to a slow child. "You have no means of independent survival, sister. No husband to provide for you, no children to care for you in your declining years, no skills that cannot be easily replaced by younger hands. This arrangement offers you security and purpose. Refusal offers you nothing but increasing dependence on family members who have their own responsibilities to consider." Elenya gathered what remained of her dignity and moved toward the door, pausing only to look back at the assembled family members one final time. "I understand now why Father spoke so often of the importance of blood ties. He knew that without them we would be capable of treating each other as strangers." The journey back to her cottage passed in a blur of numbness that protected her from the full impact of what had just occurred. Neighbors who had seemed sympathetic that morning now avoided her gaze, their foreknowledge of her fate making them complicit in their silence. The village that had been her home for 5 decades suddenly felt foreign, as if she was seeing it through the eyes of someone who no longer belonged. That evening, as she sat beside her fire surrounded by the tools and materials of her healing practice, Elenya found herself examining the blood contract that Aldrich had presented for her signature, an ancient piece of parchment written in archaic script and sealed with dark wax that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the firelight. The language was formal, almost ceremonial, speaking of obligations and exchanges that went beyond simple commerce. A soft knock interrupted her contemplation. When she opened the door, she found a figure cloaked in midnight blue, his face hidden beneath a deep hood that seemed to cast shadows even in the lamplight from her cottage. "Mistress Elenya," the visitor said, his voice carrying an accent she could not identify and a formality that seemed to belong to an earlier age. "I am Matthias, sent by Lord Varek to escort you to Raven Shallow. My master wishes you to know that your new home awaits your arrival with great anticipation." There was something unsettling about the messenger that went beyond his late-night arrival or mysterious appearance. His presence seemed to draw warmth from the air around him, and when he moved, his cloak swirled in patterns that suggested movement independent of any earthly wind. "Tomorrow morning was the agreed time," Elenya said, instinctively stepping back from the threshold. "Plans have changed," Matthias replied, his hidden features somehow conveying urgency despite their concealment. "Circumstances require your immediate departure. Lord Varek is most insistent that you begin your journey tonight." As if responding to some unspoken signal, the cottage began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. The walls that had protected her for so many years now seemed to press inward, while the door behind the mysterious messenger opened onto possibilities that were both terrifying and strangely compelling. Elenya gathered her healing pouch, a few personal belongings, and what remained of her courage. As she stepped into the night beside the enigmatic messenger, she had no way of knowing that she was walking toward a destiny that would transform not only her own understanding of herself, but the very fabric of the world she thought she knew. The blood contract crackled softly in her pack, its dark wax seal gleaming like an eye in the darkness. The journey to Raven's Hollow passed through landscapes that seemed to exist outside the natural order of the world Elenya had always known. Ancient forests pressed close to the narrow road, their branches intertwining overhead to create tunnels of shadow that blocked out the moon and stars. The very air felt different here, thicker, charged with energies that made her skin prickle and her healing instincts whisper warnings she could not quite understand. Matthias guided their horse-drawn carriage with the sure knowledge of someone who had travelled this route countless times, yet he offered no conversation, no reassurance about their destination, no answers to the questions that multiplied with each mile they covered. When Elenya attempted to engage him in discussion about Lord Varek or the nature of her new position, he responded with polite but final silence that discouraged further inquiry. The castle emerged from the morning mist like something from a fever dream, massive stone towers that seemed to grow. Directly from the rocky outcropping on which they stood, their dark walls appearing to absorb rather than reflect the weak sunlight that managed to penetrate the perpetual cloud cover surrounding the estate. No banners flew from the battlements, no guards were visible on the walls, no signs of normal castle life presented themselves to welcome or warn approaching visitors. As their carriage passed through the iron gates, Elenya noticed that the metalwork bore designs unlike anything she had seen before. Intricate patterns that seemed to shift and move when viewed from the corner of her eye. Symbols that suggested meanings just beyond her comprehension. The courtyard within was paved with stones so old their edges had been worn smooth, creating the impression of walking across a surface that had witnessed centuries of secrets. The great hall into which Matthias escorted her defied her expectations in every possible way. Instead of the cold, imposing grandeur she had anticipated, the space welcomed her with warmth that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. Tapestries in rich blues and deep purples lined the walls, their patterns depicting scenes from stories she did not recognize, but which spoke to something ancient and enduring in the human spirit. Candles burned in sconces that appeared to be crafted from some dark metal that gleamed with its own inner light, creating pools of illumination that felt both intimate and infinite. "Welcome to Raven's Hollow," a voice said from the shadows near the great fireplace, its tone carrying depths of weariness and longing that spoke of centuries rather than mere decades of experience. "I am Varek, and I have been waiting for you longer than you might imagine." He stepped into the candlelight with movements that possessed an inhuman grace, and Elenya found herself face to face with a man who challenged every assumption she had formed about her mysterious benefactor. Tall and lean, with features that suggested nobility tempered by suffering, he appeared to be perhaps 40 years of age, though his eyes held depths that spoke of experiences far beyond what any normal lifetime could contain. His dark hair showed no trace of silver, his hands bore no marks of age or labor, and his skin possessed a pale perfection that seemed almost luminous in the flickering light. "You are not what I expected," Elenya said, her healer's instincts automatically cataloguing details that did not quite align with normal human patterns. His breathing was so subtle as to be nearly imperceptible, his pulse invisible at throat or wrist, his entire presence somehow existing at one remove from the mundane world she had always inhabited. Varek smiled, and the expression transformed his austere features into something approaching warmth. "Nor are you what I anticipated, though I find myself pleasantly surprised by the reality. Your brother's correspondence suggested a woman of practical nature and healing skills, but he failed to mention the strength I see in your bearing or the intelligence that shines in your eyes. He would not have considered those qualities relevant to your purposes," Elenya replied, still studying this enigmatic figure who had purchased her services sight unseen. "Perhaps you could enlighten me about what those purposes might be." Instead of answering directly, Varek gestured toward a comfortable chair positioned near the fire. then moved to a side table where an ornate chalice sat beside a decanter filled with what appeared to be wine. The goblet itself drew her attention, crafted from some dark metal and adorned with stones that seemed to capture and hold the firelight like tiny imprisoned stars. "I have lived in this castle for longer than the memory of the surrounding villages," Varek said as he poured the wine with careful precision. "In all that time, I have been alone, not by choice, but by circumstance beyond my control. I have grown weary of silence, tired of existing without companionship, exhausted by the weight of solitary years." The midnight chalice seemed to pulse with its own rhythm as he offered it to her, its surface warm, despite having sat untouched moments before. When their fingers brushed during the exchange, Elenya felt a shock of recognition, not of him specifically, but of something fundamental about his nature that resonated with hidden aspects of her own being she had never fully understood. "You speak as though you have lived for centuries," she observed, accepting the chalice but not yet tasting its contents. "Yet you appear to be a man in his prime." "Appearances can be deceiving," Varek replied, settling into the chair across from her with fluid movements that seemed to flow rather than transition from one position to another. "Just as your family's assessment of your value was deceiving, they saw only what you had failed to produce rather than recognizing what you had actually accomplished. You know nothing of my accomplishments," Elenya said, though something in his tone suggested that statement might not be entirely accurate. "I know that you have spent 30 years healing the sick and comforting the dying," Varek replied, his voice carrying certainty about facts he should have no way of knowing. "I know that you have delivered children who might otherwise have been lost, set bones that could have crippled their owners, and eased suffering with skills that go beyond mere knowledge of herbs and remedies. I know that you have been valued by everyone except those who should have treasured you most." The wine in the chalice seemed to glow with its own inner light as Elenya raised it to her lips, its taste unlike anything she had ever experienced, rich and complex, with undertones that suggested flavors beyond the normal range of human perception. Warmth spread through her body from the first sip, but it was accompanied by something else, a sense of awakening, as if dormant aspects of her being were stirring to life for the first time. "What manner of man are you?" she asked, though part of her already suspected the answer would challenge everything she thought she knew about the natural world. Varek's smile held both sadness and anticipation. "The kind of man who has learned that loneliness is a curse far worse than any physical torment, and who hopes that companionship might prove to be its cure. You were not brought here to serve, Elenya. You were brought here to live, perhaps for the first time in your adult life, as someone valued for who you are rather than what you might produce." As the fire crackled softly in the great hearth and the mysterious chalice pulsed gently in her hands, Elenya began to understand that her journey to Ravenshollow represented more than simply a change of residence. She was stepping into a world where different rules applied, where impossible things might prove possible, and where a woman deemed worthless by her own family might discover reserves of strength and purpose she had never imagined she possessed. The midnight chalice grew warmer in her hands, its strange radiance reflecting in Varek's ancient eyes. Dawn arrived at Ravenshollow not with the golden promise that graced other places, but as a gradual lightening of shadows that never quite achieved true brightness. Elenya awakened in chambers more luxurious than any she had ever imagined, silk hangings in deep jewel tones, furniture crafted from woods that seemed to hold their own inner warmth, and windows that looked out upon gardens where flowers bloomed in defiance of the season. The night before remained vivid in her memory, though it felt more like a dream than lived experience. Varek had been gentle beyond anything she had expected, his touch reverent rather than demanding, his attention focused on her comfort and pleasure rather than his own satisfaction. There had been something almost sacred about their union, as if forces beyond their understanding had guided their movements and responses. Now, As soft morning light filtered through the chamber's tall windows, Elenya became aware of changes that went beyond the expected aftermath of intimacy. Her skin felt different, more sensitive, more alive somehow, as if every nerve had been awakened to new possibilities. The air itself seemed charged with energies that made her healing senses tingle with anticipation she could not name. A soft knock interrupted her contemplation, followed by the entrance of a woman whose appearance suggested she had served in this castle for many years. Grey-haired and dignified, she moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood the rhythms of her household perfectly. "Good morning, my lady," the woman said, setting down a tray laden with foods that filled the chamber with wonderful aromas. "I am Cordelia, the castle's housekeeper. Lord Varek has asked me to see to your comfort and answer any questions you might have about your new home." "My lady?" Elenya repeated, surprised by the title. "I was told I was to serve as companion, not to be treated as nobility." Cordelia's smile carried warmth that spoke of genuine affection rather than mere professional courtesy. "In this household, we have learned that true nobility comes from character rather than birth. Lord Varek sees qualities in you that perhaps you have not yet recognized in yourself." As Elenya accepted the offered meal, she noticed that her appetite seemed different, more acute, more specific in its desires. The fresh fruits tasted more vibrant than any she had ever eaten. The bread seemed to carry undertones of grain and earth that spoke to something primitive in her nature, and the herbal tea awakened senses she had not known she possessed. "How long have you served, Lord Varek?" she asked, studying Cordelia's face for clues about the household she had entered. "Longer than most people live," Cordelia replied, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth. "This castle has been my home for nearly 70 years, though I have aged far less than such a span would normally require. Time moves differently at Ravenshollow." Before Elenya could pursue this intriguing statement, another change made itself known, a subtle shift in the light filtering through the windows, as if the very quality of illumination had altered to accommodate new realities. She looked down at her hands and gasped at what she saw there. Around her throat hung a pendant she had not worn the night before, a delicate piece of craftsmanship that seemed to be carved from moonstone, though it pulsed with inner light that had nothing to do with reflected illumination. The lunar pendant felt warm against her skin, and as she touched it, waves of sensation spread through her body that spoke of magical forces awakening within her very cells. "The pendant," she whispered, her voice carrying wonder and more than a little fear. "Where did it come from?" Cordelia's expression grew serious, though not alarmed. "It appears only when certain conditions are met, when ancient magics recognize that change is imminent. Lord Varek will want to see you immediately. There are things he must explain, mysteries that can no longer remain hidden." The great hall felt different in the morning light, not smaller, but somehow more intimate, as if the space itself had adjusted to accommodate new relationships and deeper understanding. Varek stood before the massive fireplace, his posture suggesting a man preparing to deliver news that would alter everything. When he turned to face her, Elenya saw emotions in his expression that spoke of centuries of longing finally approaching fulfillment. "The pendant appeared during the night," he said without preamble, his voice carrying reverence that bordered on awe. "It has not manifested for over 800 years, not since the last time the ancient magics recognized a union capable of breaking the deepest curses." "I don't understand," Elenya said, though something deep within her whispered that understanding was coming whether she sought it or not. "What curses? What union?" Varek moved closer, his movements carrying the fluid grace she had noticed the previous evening, but which now seemed even more pronounced. "I am not merely old, Elenya. I am ancient, a vampire who has walked this earth for nearly a millennium, cursed to exist without the ability to create life, condemned to watch generations pass while remaining forever unchanged and forever alone. The revelation should have terrified her, should have sent her fleeing from his presence in horror and disgust. Instead, she found herself studying his face with the analytical mind of a healer, noting details that now made perfect sense: the pale perfection of his skin, the absence of normal human rhythms, the depths of weariness in his eyes that spoke of centuries rather than decades. Yet something has changed, she observed, her hand moving instinctively to the warm pendant at her throat. The magic recognizes our union as significant. More than significant, Varek replied, his voice trembling with emotions too complex for simple classification. Within hours of our joining, I can sense new life stirring within you. The woman your family deemed barren carries a child that should be impossible, a child born from the union of vampire and human, a child that may bridge two worlds that have remained separate since the dawn of recorded history. The pendant pulsed against her skin as if responding to his words, and Elenya felt a certainty that went beyond rational thought. Her body was changing, transforming in ways that defied everything she had ever known about the natural world. The child growing within her was indeed impossible by any normal measure, yet she could feel its presence as surely as she could feel her own heartbeat. "How is this possible?" she asked, though part of her had already begun to understand that some mysteries could not be explained through conventional knowledge. "Love," Varek said simply, the word carrying weight that seemed to resonate through the very stones of the castle. Love, combined with forces so ancient that they predate human understanding of magic itself. Your family saw you as barren because they measured you by ordinary standards. But you were never ordinary, Elenya. We were both waiting for the moment when impossible things could become gloriously, transformatively real. As the lunar pendant continued its gentle pulsing and the first stirrings of new life made themselves known within her changed body, Elenya began to understand that her journey to Ravenshollow represented more than escape from an unwanted fate. She had stepped into a destiny that would reshape not only her own understanding of herself, but the very nature of what was possible when two lonely souls found the courage to trust in connections that transcended the boundaries of normal existence. The castle seemed to hum with approval around them, its ancient stones bearing witness to miracles that defied every rational explanation. The library at Ravenshollow existed in defiance of everything Elenya thought she knew about the accumulation of knowledge. Shelves stretched from floor to impossibly high ceiling, filled with volumes bound in leather that seemed to shift color depending on the angle of observation. Some books appeared ancient beyond measure, their pages glowing with text that wrote itself as she watched, while others looked freshly penned, despite bearing dates that preceded the founding of kingdoms. Varek had brought her here on her third morning at the castle, when the changes in her body had become too pronounced to attribute to simple imagination. The pendant at her throat pulsed in rhythm with her altered heartbeat, and her skin seemed to glow with inner light that had nothing to do with external illumination. She was undeniably pregnant, and equally undeniably carrying a child that defied every natural law she had ever understood. "The Chronicle of Bloodlines," Varek said, placing a massive tome on the reading table before her. Its leather binding appeared to be crafted from hide, unlike any earthly creature, and the metal clasps that held it closed bore symbols that hurt to look at directly. "It contains the complete history of my kind's attempts to bridge the gap between human and vampire, along with detailed accounts of why every previous effort ended in failure." The book opened at his touch, its pages revealing text written in scripts that shifted and changed as she watched, adapting themselves to languages she could understand. The chronicle began with creation myths that spoke of vampires as guardians rather than predators, beings tasked with maintaining the balance between life and death, light and shadow, mortal understanding and eternal mystery. "Your people were meant to be protectors?" Elenya asked, tracing the illuminated letters with fingers that seemed to tingle in response to their ancient power. "We were created to serve as bridges," Varek replied, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of regret, "to help humanity understand that death is not an ending but a transformation, that the boundary between mortal and immortal is more fluid than most people realize. But something went wrong in the early centuries. Fear replaced understanding, hatred replaced cooperation, and we became the very monsters we were meant to help humanity transcend." As she continued reading, the chronicle revealed a history far more complex than the simple tales of blood-drinking predators that had shaped human understanding of vampires. The ancient texts spoke of a golden age when vampires and humans worked together, when the gifts of immortality were shared carefully with those who had earned such trust through wisdom and service. Children born from such unions possessed abilities that benefited both races, healing powers that could mend any wound, wisdom that could prevent wars, insight that could guide entire civilizations toward greater understanding. What happened to end this cooperation? Elenya asked, though part of her already suspected the answer would involve the same fear and prejudice that had shaped her own recent experiences. "The same thing that always ends golden ages," Varek said bitterly. "Jealousy, fear, and the human tendency to destroy what they cannot control or fully understand. A faction of vampires began to see humans as cattle rather than partners. Another faction of humans began to see vampires as demons rather than guardians. The children of mixed blood were caught in the middle, hunted by both sides until they learned to hide their nature or perished in the growing conflict. The chronicle's pages turned of their own accord, revealing detailed accounts of the curse that had been laid upon vampire kind during the final war between the races. No vampire would be able to create life until one was found who possessed both the power to love deeply and the wisdom to choose healing over vengeance. The curse would only be broken by a union based on genuine affection rather than mere physical attraction, a joining that honored both the mortality of human existence and the eternal nature of vampire consciousness. "The curse has held for 8 centuries, Varek continued, his finger tracing passages that glowed at his touch. "I have seen countless vampires attempt to break it through force, through trickery, through desperate unions with humans who feared them. All failed because they approached the problem as a challenge to be conquered rather than a mystery to be solved through patience and understanding." Elenya found herself focusing on passages that described the signs accompanying a successful curse-breaking. The pregnant human would experience rapid physical changes, developing abilities that bridged vampire and human nature. Her healing skills would increase exponentially, her intuitive understanding of life and death would deepen, and her connection to magical forces would become so strong that even ancient artifacts would respond to her presence. "This is why you knew about my healing abilities before we met," she realized, understanding flooding through her like warm honey. "You weren't purchasing a companion, you were hoping to find the one person capable of ending your curse." Varek's expression grew pained, as if her words had struck at carefully hidden vulnerabilities. "I was hoping, yes, but hoping and planning are different things. I could have been wrong about your nature, wrong about the potential for genuine affection between us, wrong about everything. The risk was enormous for both of us. And if you had been wrong, then I would have spent my remaining centuries caring for a woman I had inadvertently deceived, trying to make amends for raising false hopes while living with the knowledge that my loneliness was destined to be eternal." The honesty in his response touched something deep within her that had nothing to do with magical curses or supernatural transformations. This ancient being, powerful beyond human comprehension, had risked everything on the possibility that 2 lonely souls might find genuine connection despite the vast differences in their nature and experience. "But you weren't wrong," she said softly, her hand moving, to rest on the subtle curve of her belly, where impossible life was taking root and growing stronger with each passing hour. "No," Varek agreed, his voice trembling with emotions too complex for simple classification. "I wasn't wrong. You are extraordinary in ways that go beyond any magical explanation. Your family saw only what you failed to produce, but I see what you have always possessed: the capacity to heal not just bodies, but souls. The wisdom to choose, understanding over fear. The strength to love even when love seems impossible." As if responding to their conversation, the Chronicle's pages fluttered to a new section that neither of them had been reading. The text that appeared spoke of prophecies rather than history, of a child who would possess abilities that could reshape the relationship between mortal and immortal realms. This child would carry the best qualities of both bloodlines while being limited by the weaknesses of neither. Through this bridge being, vampire and human could finally understand each other well enough to move beyond ancient hatreds toward new forms of cooperation. "Our child," Elenya whispered, the words carrying weight that seemed to resonate through the library's ancient stones. "Our child is meant to change everything." Outside the library's tall windows, storm clouds gathered with unnatural speed, as if forces that preferred the old divisions between vampire and human were already mobilizing to prevent the birth of the bridge that could end centuries of separation and fear. The Chronicle of Bloodlines grew warm beneath her hands, its ancient knowledge recognizing that the future it had long prophesied was finally beginning to unfold. The obsidian mirror materialized in Elenya's chambers on the morning she first felt the child move within her womb, a sensation that carried with it power far beyond normal quickening. The scrying glass hung in the air without visible support, its surface dark as midnight, yet somehow alive with swirling depths that suggested it could peer into realms beyond normal perception. When she gazed into its depths, images formed that showed her threats gathering like storm clouds on multiple horizons. In the mirror's supernatural vision, she saw vampire lords in distant castles, stirring from centuries of slumber, their ancient faces twisted with rage at news that the curse binding their kind might finally be broken. These were not creatures like Varek, who had retained their capacity for love and wisdom through the long years of isolation. These were beings who had embraced the monstrous aspects of their nature, who saw the potential birth of a bridge child as a threat to the dark power they had accumulated during the time of separation. "They call themselves the Eternal Council," Varek explained, as he joined her before the scrying glass, his expression grim as he interpreted the visions. 7 vampire lords who have ruled their territories through fear and domination for the past 8 centuries. They see our child as a threat to their authority, a living symbol that vampires can choose a different path than the one they have followed. The mirror's surface shifted, revealing new images that made Elenya's breath catch in her throat. In the great cathedral of the nearest city, bishops and abbots bent over ancient texts, their faces alight with the fervor of those who had found religious justification for violence. Holy warriors sharpened blessed weapons, while priests prepared sacred oils meant to burn vampire flesh like acid. "The Church has declared our union an abomination," she observed, watching as men in ecclesiastical robes pointed at maps of the region surrounding Ravenshallow. "They see our child as proof that unholy forces are gaining strength in the world. They fear what they cannot control," Varek replied, his hand moving to rest protectively on her shoulder. "For centuries, they have preached that the boundary between human and supernatural is absolute, that any crossing of that divide represents corruption that must be destroyed. Our child threatens the very foundation of their worldview." But the most painful vision was yet to come. The obsidian mirror's depths revealed the familiar streets of Thornwick, where her brother Aldrich stood before a crowd of villagers, his voice raised in righteous indignation as he spoke of the curse that had befallen his family through Elenya's unholy alliance. The coins that Lord Varek had paid for her were displayed prominently, now described as payment for her soul rather than compensation for her service. "They're saying I've brought damnation upon the entire village," Elenya whispered, watching as people she had healed and comforted for decades turned away from any mention of her name. "My own brother is leading them in prayers for my destruction." "Fear makes people cruel," Varek said gently, though she could hear the anger beneath his controlled tone. "Your brother has always resented your strength. Now he can frame that resentment as religious duty." The mirror showed Willem, Aldrich's eldest son, accepting a purse of silver from men in the distinctive armor of vampire hunters. The conversation was too distant for sound, but the gestures and expressions made the nature of their bargain clear. Her nephew was providing information about the route to Raven's Hollow in exchange for payment and the promise that the family would be spared when the Holy War began. "They're being paid to betray you," she realized, her healing hands clenching into fists as maternal instincts she had never known she possessed rose to fierce life. "Your own blood seeks to profit from your destruction." Varek's face hardened into an expression that reminded her forcefully of his true nature. Perhaps it's time they learned that some betrayals carry consequences they hadn't considered. "No," Elenya said firmly, surprising herself with the authority in her voice. "Violence will only prove their point about our nature. We must find another way to protect ourselves and our child." As if responding to her words, the pendant at her throat began to pulse with increased intensity, and she felt power stirring within her that went far beyond anything she had experienced during her years as a village healer. Her connection to life forces was deepening daily, allowing her to sense the health and intentions of people at increasingly great distances. More importantly, she was beginning to understand that her influence could extend beyond simple healing to encompass the kind of deep transformation that might change hearts as well as bodies. "There are others gathering who support our cause," Varek said, gesturing toward the mirror as new visions formed in its depths. "Vampires who have retained their humanity despite the centuries of isolation. Humans who have grown weary of the fear and hatred that has dominated relations between our kinds. They recognize that our child represents hope for a better future." The scrying glass revealed a hidden network of supporters, vampire scholars who had spent centuries studying ways to break the curse, human mystics who understood that the supernatural world contained wonders as well as terrors, even some progressive members of the clergy who believed that divine love could transcend the boundaries that human fear had erected between different forms of consciousness. "But they are scattered and few," Elenya observed, studying the faces of their potential allies. "While our enemies are organized and numerous, which is why we must prepare for siege," Varek replied grimly. "Raven's Hollow has withstood attacks before. Its defenses are both physical and magical, designed to protect against enemies both mortal and supernatural. But this time will be different. This time they will come not just to destroy me, but to prevent the birth of our child." That evening, as Elenya felt the baby's movements growing stronger within her transformed body, she stood at the window of her chambers, watching Varek and his loyal servants preparing the castle's ancient defenses. Magical wards were being reinforced, weapons both blessed and cursed were being brought from hidden arsenals, and messages were being sent to their scattered allies, calling for aid in the coming battle. The obsidian mirror floated beside her, its dark surface continuing to reveal new threats as they materialized across the land. Enemy forces were marshalling with a speed that suggested supernatural coordination, vampire lords sharing intelligence with human hunters, church authorities providing blessed weapons to secular armies, her own family serving as guides for forces that sought her destruction. But in the mirror's depths, she also saw something that gave her hope. The child within her womb glowed with a light that seemed to push back the darkness, its very presence beginning to affect the world around it in ways that suggested transformation rather than destruction. This child would indeed bridge two worlds, but not through conquest or domination. Through the simple but revolutionary act of existing, of proving that love could transcend any boundary that fear might erect. The obsidian mirror pulsed with dark fire, bearing witness to the gathering storm while reflecting the growing light that would soon emerge to meet it. The celestial codex appeared without warning in the castle's highest tower, a chamber Elenya had never known existed until the ancient stones themselves called to her in dreams she could not ignore. The star-metal tablet hung suspended in a column of silver light that seemed to descend directly from the heavens, its surface covered in script that shifted between languages and symbols as if the very cosmos was struggling to communicate truths too vast for any single form of expression. Varek found her there at midnight, drawn by the same irresistible pull that had awakened her from sleep and guided her steps up staircases that materialized as she needed them. His face showed wonder mixed with apprehension as he gazed upon the artifact that had been prophesied for millennia but never before witnessed by living beings. "The Celestial Codex," he whispered, his voice carrying reverence that bordered on fear. "It appears only when cosmic forces align to reveal truths that will reshape the fundamental nature of reality." The tablet's surface pulsed with light that seemed to respond to their presence, and as they watched, new text began to form, not inscribed by any earthly tool, but written by forces that existed beyond the boundaries of normal space and time. The words that appeared challenged everything they thought they understood about their situation, their child, and the very nature of their connection to each other. The prophecy began with revelations about Elenya's heritage that struck her like physical blows. She was not merely the descendant of vampire hunters, as Varek had discovered in his research. She was the last in a bloodline that traced back to the original creators of vampire-kind humans who had been gifted with immortality, not as a curse, but as a sacred trust. Her ancestors had been the first bridge builders, the original mediators between mortal and eternal realms, until the Great War had scattered their bloodline and hidden their legacy beneath layers of forgotten history. "Your infertility was never a failing," Varek said, his voice filled with awe as he read the star-metal script. "It was a protection, a magical safeguard that would preserve your unique genetic heritage until the moment when it could fulfill its cosmic purpose. You could only conceive when united with one who carried the original vampire essence, not the corrupted version that emerged from centuries of isolation and fear, but the pure form that existed before the Great Division. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. As the celestial script continued to unfold, it revealed that Varek himself was not simply an ancient vampire who had retained his capacity for love. He was the last surviving member of the original Vampire Council, the very beings who had first accepted the gift of immortality to serve as guardians and guides for humanity. His memories of those early centuries had been suppressed by trauma and the weight of centuries, but the prophecy's awakening was beginning to restore his true identity. "I remember," he said suddenly, his voice changing in timbre and tone as suppressed memories flooded back. "I remember the ceremony where we accepted our transformation. I remember the joy on human faces when we first demonstrated that death was not an ending, but a transition. I remember the golden age when our kinds worked together to explore the mysteries of existence." The tablet revealed that the curse binding vampire reproduction had not been imposed by human enemies, as they had believed, but by Varek's own sister, the last member of the original council, who had gone into hiding centuries ago when the Great War began. She had recognized that vampire kind was becoming corrupted by isolation and fear, and had imposed the curse as a safeguard to prevent the creation of offspring who might inherit that corruption rather than the original noble purposes of their race. Seraphina, Varek breathed, the name emerging from memories that had lain buried for 800 years. She told me she was going into eternal sleep to escape the pain of watching our kind become monsters. But she was actually preparing for this moment, waiting for the time when the original bloodlines could be reunited and the curse could be safely lifted. The Celestial Codex showed them visions of Seraphina's current location, a hidden sanctuary deep beneath the mountains where she had spent centuries in magical stasis, protected by wards so powerful that even the Eternal Council had never suspected her survival. She had been waiting for the signs that would herald the birth of a true bridge child, a being who could restore the original purpose of vampire-human cooperation. But the most startling revelation came when the prophecy revealed the true extent of the manipulation that had brought them together. Elenya's family had not simply decided to sell her on their own initiative. They had been subtly influenced by Seraphina's agents, mortals who had inherited fragments of the original cooperation between vampire and human bloodlines. The mysterious messenger Matthias was not merely Varek's servant, but one of these hereditary guardians, tasked with ensuring that the right circumstances came together at the prophesied time. Everything was orchestrated, Elenya realized, her hand moving protectively to her belly, where their child continued to grow stronger each day. From my brother's resentment to your loneliness, to the timing of our meeting, all of it was guided by forces we never suspected. But our feelings for each other, Varek said urgently, as if fearing that revelation of the manipulation might somehow diminish the genuine affection that had grown between them. The love we've discovered, that part was real, wasn't it? The Celestial Codex pulsed with warm light, as if responding directly to his question, and new script appeared that spoke of the fundamental truth underlying all the cosmic machinations. The prophecy could only be fulfilled through genuine love, freely given and honestly received. No amount of manipulation could create the emotional and spiritual connection required to break curses, rooted in the deepest layers of magical reality. Seraphina's agents could create opportunities, but they could not manufacture the authentic human emotions that made the miracle possible. The manipulation brought us together, Elenya said softly, understanding flooding through her as she read the star metal words. But everything that happened after our meeting, everything that truly matters, came from choices we made freely. The tablet revealed one final truth that transformed their understanding of the stakes involved in their situation. The child they carried would indeed serve as a bridge between vampire and human realms, but not simply by existing as a hybrid being. The child would possess abilities that could fundamentally alter the nature of both bloodlines, ending the artificial divisions that had been imposed during the Great War and restoring the original unity that had characterized the early days of vampire-human cooperation. This transformation would not be limited to their immediate offspring. The child's very existence would send ripples through the magical fabric that connected all vampire and human souls, awakening dormant potentials in both races and gradually dissolving the barriers that fear and misunderstanding had erected over the centuries. Within a few generations, the distinction between vampire and human would become meaningless, replaced by a unified race that combined the best qualities of both lineages while suffering from the limitations of neither. No wonder our enemies are so determined to prevent the birth, Varek said grimly as the full implications became clear. This child threatens not just their individual power, but the very concept of separation that has defined supernatural politics for 8 centuries. The Celestial Codex began to fade as its message was completed, but not before revealing one final piece of crucial information. The birth would trigger a convergence of magical forces that would temporarily weaken the barriers between dimensions, allowing both their allies and their enemies to access powers normally beyond their reach. The final battle for the future of vampire-human relations would be fought not just with conventional weapons, but with fundamental forces of creation and destruction that could reshape reality itself. As the star metal tablet dissolved back into the column of silver light that had brought it, Elenya felt the child within her responding to the cosmic revelations with movements that seemed almost like applause. Their baby understood, on some level beyond normal consciousness, that it carried the hopes and fears of two entire races within its developing body. "We need to contact Serafina," she said, her voice carrying new authority that came from understanding her true heritage. If she's been orchestrating events for centuries, she must have planned for what comes next. Outside the tower windows, the first light of dawn was beginning to break over Ravenshollow, but Elenya knew that the real dawn, the end of the long night of separation between vampire and human, was still to come. The Harmony blade manifested in the castle's forge as if summoned by the approaching storm of conflict. Unlike any weapon Elenya had ever seen, it appeared to be crafted from both blessed silver and vampire essence, its surface rippling with energies that spoke of opposing forces finding perfect balance. The blade itself gleamed with holy light, while its hilt pulsed with the deep crimson that characterized vampire magic, two elements that should have destroyed each other, instead creating something entirely new. Varek held the weapon with reverence that bordered on disbelief, his ancient hands trembling slightly as he felt the power contained within its impossible construction. "The prophecies spoke of this," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "A weapon that could only be forged when the barriers between vampire and human began to dissolve. It's not meant to destroy our enemies, it's meant to transform them." The past week had brought changes to Ravenshollow that went far beyond simple military preparation. The castle itself seemed to be awakening from centuries of slumber, revealing chambers and passages that had remained hidden since the golden age of vampire-human cooperation. Ancient defenses that had been dormant for 800 years hummed to life, their magical energies responding to the presence of the bridge child growing within Elenya's womb. She had grown large with pregnancy at a rate that defied normal human gestation, her body adapting to accommodate a child whose supernatural nature required accelerated development. The baby moved constantly now, its kicks carrying power that sometimes left glowing handprints visible through her skin. Her own abilities continued to expand daily. She could now sense the emotional states of people dozens of miles away, could heal injuries with a touch that left no scars, and could commune directly with the magical forces that bound the castle's ancient stones together. "The enemy forces are larger than we anticipated," Cordelia reported as she entered the forge, her usually calm demeanor showing signs of strain. The loyal housekeeper had revealed herself to be far more than a simple servant, possessing knowledge of military strategy and magical warfare that spoke of her true role as one of Serafina's hereditary guardians. "Our scrying shows at least 3 separate armies converging on our position, the Eternal Council's vampire forces from the north, church warriors from the east, and a mixed force of human and rogue supernatural beings from the south." Varek studied the tactical maps that Cordelia spread across the forge's great table, his expression growing grimmer as he traced the approaching routes of their various enemies. "They're coordinating their assault to arrive simultaneously. We'll be facing attacks from multiple directions with no opportunity to defeat them separately." "What of our allies?" Elenya asked, though she already sensed the answer from the worried emotions emanating from both her companions. "Have any of the vampires who retain their humanity responded to our calls for aid?" "Some," Cordelia replied carefully. "Perhaps 24 vampires have pledged their support, along with a handful of human mystics who understand what we're trying to accomplish. But they face the same problem we do. Our enemies control the territory between their locations and ours. Most of our potential allies are trapped behind enemy lines." The situation was dire by any conventional measure, yet Elenya found herself strangely calm as she contemplated the approaching battle. The child within her womb pulsed with power that seemed to whisper reassurances she could not quite understand, and her connection to the castle's magical defenses grew stronger each day. She was beginning to understand that this conflict would not be won through superior numbers or conventional tactics, but through the transformation of the battlefield itself. "Seraphina's message arrived this morning," Varek said, producing a scroll whose parchment seemed to be woven from moonlight and starfire. "She's awakening from her centuries of stasis, but the process cannot be rushed. She'll arrive after the battle begins, not before it." Elenya read the message with growing understanding of the cosmic forces at work around them. Seraphina's awakening was tied to the same magical currents that would soon bring their child into the world. The timing was not coincidental. The birth and the reunion of the original Vampire Council would occur simultaneously, creating a convergence of power that could reshape the fundamental nature of reality. She's planned this moment for 800 years. Elenya realized her healer's instincts, recognizing patterns within patterns. Every detail has been orchestrated to create the maximum possible transformation. We're not just fighting to protect our child, we're fighting to birth a new age. The week passed in a blur of preparation that mixed mundane military planning with supernatural ritual. Varek worked with his handful of loyal servants to reinforce the castle's physical defenses, while Elenya focused on strengthening the magical wards that would protect them from supernatural assault. The Harmony Blade remained constantly at Varek's side, its presence seeming to calm the more volatile energies that surrounded their preparations. Messages continued to arrive from the outside world, bringing news that both encouraged and alarmed them. In several distant cities, spontaneous uprisings had begun among humans who possessed trace amounts of the original bridge bloodlines. These people, most of whom had never known of their supernatural heritage, suddenly found themselves drawn to defend the cause of vampire-human unity. Their numbers were small, but their passion was intense, driven by genetic memories that connected them to the golden age of cooperation. Conversely, the organized opposition was revealing levels of coordination that suggested supernatural influence far beyond what they had initially anticipated. The Eternal Council had apparently been preparing for this possibility for decades, building alliances with human religious extremists and secular powers who could be convinced that vampire-human cooperation threatened the natural order. Their combined forces numbered in the thousands, equipped with weapons both blessed and cursed, led by individuals whose hatred of change had been refined across centuries of conflict. "My brother has arrived," Elenya said softly, as her expanding awareness detected familiar emotional signatures approaching from the east. Through the obsidian mirror's continued revelations, she could see Aldrich and his sons marching with the church forces, their faces alight with righteous fervor that masked deeper motivations of greed and resentment. "He's convinced himself that he's serving a holy cause, but I can sense his true feelings. He hopes to claim Ravenshallow's treasures once we're defeated. Family betrayal cuts deepest," Varek observed, his hand moving to rest on her shoulder in a gesture that had become natural between them. "Are you prepared to face him in battle?" "I'm prepared to show him what he chose to reject," Elenya replied, feeling the baby's movements intensify as if responding to her emotional state. Perhaps seeing the miracle he helped make possible will open his eyes to his own blindness. That evening, as the final preparations neared completion, Varek led her to the castle's highest tower where they could look out over the surrounding landscape. In the distance, campfires dotted, horizon like fallen stars, 3 separate armies settling into position for the assault that would begin with dawn. The sight should have been terrifying, yet Elenya felt only a deep peace that seemed to emanate from her connection to the child within her womb. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Varek said quietly, his ancient eyes reflecting centuries of loneliness that was finally approaching its end, "I want you to know that these past weeks with you have been worth every moment of the long centuries that preceded them. You have given me back not just the possibility of love, but the memory of what it means to hope." "Our love was always meant to be," Elenya replied, her hand finding his, as they stood together beneath stars that seemed unusually bright. "Every choice we made, every moment of connection, every instant of trust, all of it was real, regardless of the cosmic forces that brought us together." The harmony blade at Varek's side pulsed with gentle light, as if blessing their affirmation of love in the face of approaching conflict. Around them, Raven's Hollow hummed with magical energies that spoke of ancient purposes finally approaching fulfillment. The castle's stones seemed to sing with anticipation, their music audible only to those whose hearts had learned to bridge the gap between mortal understanding and eternal mystery. As midnight approached, Elenya felt the first stirrings of labor beginning within her transformed body. The child who would change everything was preparing to enter the world, just as the forces that opposed that change were positioning themselves for final assault. The timing was perfect in ways that transcended mere coincidence. The birth and the battle would occur together, creating a moment when the future of vampire-human relations would be decided not through violence alone, but through the simple miracle of new life choosing to exist despite all opposition. The harmony blade sang softly in the night air, its impossible nature, a promise that tomorrow would bring changes that neither pure destruction nor simple preservation could accomplish. Dawn broke over Raven's Hollow with the sound of war horns echoing across the valley like the voices of angry gods. The Shield of Ages materialized around the castle as the first enemy arrows struck its walls, a translucent barrier that shimmered with the combined will of every vampire and human who had ever believed in the possibility of cooperation between their kinds. The ancient protective magic had not been seen for 8 centuries, yet it responded to the crisis with power that seemed drawn from the very foundations of the earth. Elenya watched from the tower window as 3 massive armies crested the surrounding hills simultaneously, their banners stark against the morning sky. The vampire forces of the Eternal Council moved with inhuman coordination, their pale forms gliding across the battlefield like deadly shadows. To the east, church warriors marched in perfect formation, their armor gleaming with holy symbols and their weapons radiating blessed light that hurt to look upon directly. From the south came the most chaotic force, a mixture of human mercenaries, rogue supernatural beings, and creatures whose nature defied easy classification. "The shield will hold for now," Varek said, his voice tight with concentration as he channeled power into the ancient defenses. The harmony blade at his side pulsed in rhythm with the protective barrier, its impossible nature allowing him to strengthen magic that should have rejected his vampiric essence. But they're bringing siege engines blessed by 3 different religious traditions. The combination may prove more than even our defenses can withstand. A contraction seized Elenya with intensity that left her gasping, the child within her womb responding to the approaching conflict with movements that seemed almost eager. Her labor was advancing rapidly, driven by magical forces that connected her body's rhythms to the cosmic significance of the moment. Each wave of pain brought with it flashes of supernatural insight, visions of possible futures that branched and shifted depending on the choices made in the next few hours. "The baby comes now," she said, her healer's training helping her recognize the unmistakable signs of imminent birth. "The timing is not coincidental. Our child chooses to enter the world at the moment when everything hangs in balance." Cordelia appeared at her side with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this moment across decades of faithful service. "The birthing chamber is ready, my lady. The ancient protections will shield you during your labor, but the castle's defenses require Lord Varek's presence on the battlements." The first direct assault began as catapults launched stones, blessed with enough holy power to crack the Shield of Ages upon impact. Each strike sent ripples of disruption through the magical barrier, and Elenya could feel the strain in her own body as her connection to the castle's defenses deepened with every moment. She was no longer simply sheltering within Ravenshallow's protection, she was becoming part of it, her life force intertwining with the ancient magic in ways that made her both more powerful and more vulnerable. "Go," she told Varek, seeing the conflict in his eyes as he struggled between his desire to remain at her side and his duty to coordinate their defense. "Our child and I will be protected by forces older than any weapon our enemies possess. But the castle needs its lord to guide the battle." Varek's kiss carried centuries of longing and the promise of eternity before he departed for the walls, leaving Elenya in the capable hands of servants who revealed depths of knowledge and power that spoke of their true heritage as guardians of ancient mysteries. As another contraction gripped her, she felt the baby's magical signature blazing brighter, its presence beginning to affect reality in ways that rippled outward from the castle like stones thrown into still water. The siege engines roared again, and this time the blessed projectiles struck with enough force to send cracks through the shield of ages. The enemy forces pressed forward, testing the barrier's weak points while chanting in languages that predated modern tongues. Some of the incantations were designed to bind vampire magic, others to purify corrupted human souls, and still others to prevent the birth of beings who bridged supernatural boundaries. From the battlements came the sound of the harmony blade singing as Varek wielded it against the first wave of attackers who managed to breach the outer defenses. The weapon's impossible nature allowed it to strike vampire and human enemies with equal effectiveness, but more importantly, each wound it inflicted carried the potential for transformation rather than simple destruction. Those struck by the blade found their hatred dissolving, replaced by confusion, and then growing understanding of the artificial nature of the divisions between their kinds. But the enemy numbers were vast, and for every attacker transformed by the Harmony Blade's touch, 10 more pressed forward with fanatical determination. The shield of ages flickered as the combined assault of blessed siege engines and cursed sorcery found resonance points in its ancient structure. Through her expanding awareness, Elenya could sense that the barrier would not hold much longer against such coordinated assault. Another contraction brought her to her knees, but with the pain came a surge of power that sent waves of healing energy throughout the castle. Wounded defenders found their injuries mending, exhausted magic users discovered their strength renewed, and the Shield of Ages blazed with sudden brightness that forced the attacking armies to shield their eyes. The child was coming, and with its arrival, the true battle for the future of both races would begin. The crown of dawn materialized upon the child's head in the same instant that its first cry split the air, a sound that carried across the battlefield with power that transcended normal acoustics. The delicate circlet appeared to be woven from crystallized sunlight and starfire, marking the newborn as the prophesied bridge between worlds, while simultaneously sending a wave of transformative energy that reached every soul within miles of Ravenshallow. Elenya held her daughter against her chest, marveling at the perfect tiny features that somehow combined the best aspects of both vampire and human heritage. The baby's eyes held depths of ancient wisdom despite being only moments old, and her skin glowed with the same inner light that had begun manifesting in the lunar pendant during Elenya's pregnancy. But it was the crown of dawn that truly marked this child as something unprecedented, its presence declaring to all supernatural senses that a new age had begun. "She's perfect," Cordelia whispered, tears streaming down her weathered face as she gazed upon the fulfillment of centuries of hope and planning. The prophecies spoke truly. She carries the light that will heal the ancient divisions. Outside the birthing chamber, the sounds of battle had changed dramatically. The war cries and clash of weapons were giving way to something unprecedented, voices raised in wonder, the clatter of dropped arms, and a growing silence that spoke of conflict transformed into something entirely different. Through the castle's tall windows, golden light was spreading across the battlefield like dawn, breaking over a world that had been trapped in eternal night. The child's birth cry had done more than simply announce her arrival. The sound carried within it a harmonic frequency that resonated with the deepest magical foundations that connected all vampire and human souls. 8 centuries of artificial separation began to dissolve as the bridge child's very existence proved that the boundaries between the races were illusion rather than absolute truth. On the battlefield below, the most remarkable transformation was taking place among the vampire forces of the Eternal Council. These ancient beings, who had spent centuries embracing the monstrous aspects of their nature, suddenly found themselves remembering what they had lost when cooperation with humanity ended. The golden light emanating from the newborn awakened memories that had been buried beneath layers of hatred and isolation, memories of the joy they had once felt when using their immortal gifts to help rather than terrorize mortals. Lord Malachar, eldest of the Eternal Council, dropped his cursed blade as centuries of suppressed emotion flooded through his consciousness. For the first time in 800 years, he remembered his human name, remembered the woman he had loved before accepting the gift of immortality, remembered the nobility of purpose that had originally motivated his transformation. Around him, his vampire warriors experienced similar awakenings, their faces showing confusion and wonder as artificial hatreds dissolved. The church forces experienced their own form of transformation. The golden light that surrounded them carried within it a spiritual purity that surpassed any blessing they had ever encountered. Archbishop Tormund, who had led the holy warriors in their crusade against supernatural corruption, found himself kneeling in the mud as divine revelation flooded his consciousness. The child's light showed him that the separation between sacred and supernatural was another false division, that the divine worked through all forms of consciousness that chose love over fear. "The barriers are falling," Varek said, as he burst into the birthing chamber, his face alight with wonder and disbelief. The harmony blade at his side sang with pure joy, its impossible nature finally finding perfect resonance in a world where opposites were, learning to unite rather than destroy each other. The armies are laying down their weapons. Some are weeping, others are embracing former enemies, but none are fighting. Elenya looked down at her daughter, who gazed back with eyes that seemed to hold infinite compassion. The crown of dawn pulsed gently, and with each pulse, the wave of transformation spread further across the land. In distant kingdoms, other barriers began to weaken. The walls between life and death became more permeable. The divisions between magic and mundane started to blur, and the artificial categories that had shaped supernatural politics for millennia revealed their ultimately arbitrary nature. She's not just bridging vampire and human. Elenya realized, her healer's instincts recognizing patterns of change that went far beyond their immediate situation. She's healing separations that have existed since the beginning of recorded history, through the obsidian mirror, which continued to float nearby. Despite the cosmic changes reshaping reality, they could see the effects spreading like ripples across the entire continent. In vampire strongholds, ancient lords were emerging from their isolation to seek reconciliation with human communities they had terrorized for centuries. In human cities, mystics and scholars were discovering that their supernatural fears had prevented them from accessing wisdom that could benefit all of civilization. But the most profound transformation was occurring within the individuals who had participated in the siege. Elenya's brother Aldrich stood in the courtyard below, his face streaming with tears as he finally understood the magnitude of what he had tried to destroy. The golden light surrounding him was burning away the resentment and greed that had motivated his betrayal, leaving behind the memory of the sister who had spent her life serving others with no thought of personal gain. The crown of dawn flared with brilliant radiance, and for a moment, every soul within 100 miles experienced perfect unity. Vampire and human, mortal and immortal, sacred and supernatural, all revealed as facets of a single, magnificent whole that had been fragmented by fear and misunderstanding, but could be healed through love and acceptance. The siege was over, but something far greater than mere victory had been achieved. The Unity Stone began its formation in the castle courtyard 3 days after the birth, growing from the exact spot where former enemies had first embraced as the transformative power of the Bridge Child dissolved centuries of artificial hatred. The crystalline structure rose from the earth with natural grace, its surface reflecting not just light, but the souls of all who approached it, showing them the fundamental connections that bound vampire and human together in ways that transcended any superficial differences. Elenya stood beside the growing monument, her daughter cradled in her arms, watching as representatives from across the continent arrived to witness the miracle that had changed everything. The crown of dawn no longer blazed with the overwhelming radiance it had shown during the child's birth, but it continued to pulse gently, a constant reminder that the age of separation had ended and something far more beautiful had taken its place. "She grows stronger each day," Varek observed, his voice filled with wonder that had not dimmed since their daughter's arrival. The baby did indeed seem to develop at an accelerated pace, not just physically, but in terms of the supernatural abilities that marked her as something entirely new in the world. When she smiled, flowers bloomed in winter gardens. When she laughed, the sick found their ailments mysteriously healed. When she slept, peaceful dreams visited even the most tormented souls within miles of Ravenshallow. Lord Malachar approached them with steps that still carried the fluid grace of his vampiric nature, but his expression showed none of the ancient arrogance that had characterized the Eternal Council for 8 centuries. The transformation wrought by the child's birth had restored his original nobility of purpose, and he now served as spokesman for the vampires who sought to rebuild their relationship with humanity. "The old councils are dissolving," he reported, his voice carrying satisfaction rather than regret. "Across the vampire territories, the ancient lords are emerging from their strongholds to seek reconciliation with the human communities they have terrorized. Some resistance remains, but it weakens daily as the child's influence spreads." Archbishop Tormund joined their circle, his ecclesiastical robes now adorned with symbols that honored both divine mystery and supernatural wonder. The Church's initial opposition to the vampire-human union had transformed into enthusiastic support as religious leaders recognized that the Bridge Child's arrival represented divine blessing rather than corruption. The theological implications continue to unfold, he said, his scholarly mind clearly relishing the challenge of reinterpreting centuries of doctrine in light of new understanding. "We're discovering that many of our sacred texts actually prophesied this moment, though the prophecies were disguised in metaphorical language that we misunderstood. The barriers we thought were divinely mandated were actually human constructions that obscured rather than revealed divine will." But the most meaningful reconciliation came when Elenya's family finally approached her with faces that showed genuine remorse rather than calculated self-interest. Aldrich moved slowly, his usual confidence replaced by the humble bearing of someone who had come to understand the magnitude of his own blindness. "Sister," he said, his voice breaking on the simple word, "I have spent these past days trying to find words that could express my shame, my regret, my desperate hope for forgiveness. But every phrase I consider seems inadequate to address the enormity of what I tried to destroy." Elenya studied her brother's face, seeing through her enhanced perceptions the genuine transformation that had occurred within his soul. The golden light that had surrounded him during the battle's end had burned away not just his hatred and resentment, but the fundamental selfishness that had motivated his treatment of her for so many years. "You were afraid," she said gently, her voice carrying the wisdom that had always been her greatest gift. afraid that a world where worth wasn't measured by bloodlines and production would leave you without value or purpose. But you have always had value, Aldrich. You were simply too frightened to recognize it. Willem stepped forward, his young face showing maturity that spoke of harsh lessons learned through witnessing the consequences of hatred. We brought maps to help the church forces find Raven Shallow. We took money to provide information about your defenses. We celebrated when we heard that armies were gathering to destroy you. His voice grew thick with emotion. How do we live with that knowledge? How do we earn the right to call ourselves your family again? The baby in Elenya's arms chose that moment to reach toward her uncle with tiny fingers that seemed to glow with inner light. When Willem hesitantly extended his own hand, the child's touch sent waves of healing energy through him that visibly eased the anguish he had been carrying since the battle's end. "Redemption is not earned," Elenya said, understanding flowing through her as she watched her daughter work her subtle magic on broken souls. "It's accepted. The question is not whether you deserve forgiveness, but whether you're prepared to live differently in the future." The Unity Stone pulsed with approving warmth, and around the courtyard, other scenes of reconciliation played out as former enemies discovered that their fundamental similarities far outweighed their superficial differences. Vampire and human children played together while their parents discussed plans for cooperative ventures that would benefit both communities. Scholars from different traditions shared knowledge that had been hoarded for centuries behind walls of suspicion and fear. "What do we call her?" Cordelia asked, gesturing toward the baby who had made all of this possible. "She needs a name that honors both her heritage and her destiny." Elenya looked down at her daughter, seeing in those ancient young eyes the wisdom that would guide the world toward new forms of cooperation and understanding. "Aurora," she said, the name coming to her with the certainty of revelation. "She is the dawn of a new age, the light that ends the long night of separation." As if responding to her naming, the crown of dawn flared with gentle radiance that spread through the Unity Stone and out across the gathered crowd. In that light, everyone present could see glimpses of the future that Aurora's existence had made possible, a world where vampire and human worked together to explore the deepest mysteries of existence, where the gifts of immortality were shared wisely rather than hoarded selfishly, where the artificial barriers between natural and supernatural dissolved in favor of unified understanding. The Unity Stone completed its formation as the sun set over Raven's Hollow, creating a permanent monument to the moment when love proved stronger than fear, when understanding conquered ignorance, and when two lonely souls discovered that their connection could heal wounds that had festered for 8 centuries. Aurora slept peacefully in her mother's arms, the crown of dawn glowing softly as it marked her as the bridge between worlds, not through conquest or force, but through the simple miracle of existing as living proof that impossible things become possible when hearts choose unity over division.